All right, so here we're getting started with fragmentation to connectivity. So on Tuesday, Ryan and Matt will talk about connectivity, and they're going to focus mostly on the modern science of connectivity. And so I want to talk a bit about the history leading up to those kinds of studies, and it really goes back to fragmentation. And this is the part of the lecture where or the part of the course where we're really moving into thinking about aggregations of species, community level conservation things. So for today, I'm going to be talking about habitat loss leading to fragmentation, classic studies in fragmentation, fragmentation issues leading to concerns about corridors, and thinking about island biogeographic theory as a basis for reserve design, and then how that moved into research on metapopulations and metapopulation dynamics, but that there are all sorts of ways that people are thinking about benefits of connectivity, things like migration corridors, connected landscapes for climate change, and then there's also other issues that fall under the broader rubric of corridors. For example, there's lots of wildlife that move around and that as a consequence of move around get hit by cars on roads, and so there's a big effort to decrease roads as barriers to movement, and this is a form of building corridors, they're movement corridors, and so it's a complementary problem, but it's a little bit separate, I think, from a corridor science as it has been. And then on Thursday, we'll go back to island biogeography as reserve design, and then move on to thinking about scorecards of species richness and how that leads us to complementarity and minimizing cost and the Marxan solution to reserve design, and then the prioritizing losses and the zonation solution to reserve design. And we'll hope to move into then thinking about other forms of reserve design and begin to link this back into the social aspects of this, which includes systematic conservation planning. So those are the next two lectures, and we can skip on down to this slide here. And this encapsulates the week for us nicely. The four horsemen of the apocalypse were conquest, war, famine, and death. But Jared Diamond and others have called for invoking the four horsemen of the biodiversity apocalypse as habitat loss, overexploitation, introduced species, and pollution or toxins. And on top of that, others have added new horsemen, so it's getting to be quite a large stable of horses. But the issue, the graph over on the right, for example, is a listing of the number or the percentage of species that are on the endangered species list that have listed problems such as habitat loss and degradation, invasive species, pollution, overharvesting. And so you can see those four horsemen of the conservation apocalypse now, and you see that habitat loss is the winner. It's the the largest driver of threat, and so it has been of particular interest in thinking about conservation strategies. And one of the ways that people think about this is with respect to fragmentation. When you have loss of habitat, you have smaller fragments that are left. And so there's a lot of effort to be thinking about what is it about fragments that make them less capable of protecting biological diversity than their formerly larger counterparts, other than simply just size. So Saunders and others did a review of fragmentation studies and talked about microclimatic effects, things such as solar radiation and wind as edge effects, water flux in smaller fragments, distance effects, distance to other fragments, and the degree of isolation of a fragment, time since isolation, and the connectivity. And also then attributes of the fragments themselves, remnant size, fragment shape, and the matrix composition. And so I'll post that paper up. It's a big, good general reference to thinking about fragmentation and the general effects that it may have. I should mention that Lenore Farig is also another researcher who has done an awful lot of work on fragments and fragmentation. So we can harken back in the idea of connectivity to the use of island biogeography as a model for reserve design in conservation. Down in the bottom left here, we have the classic graph for island biogeography theory, which is that the number of species will increase with island area, as shown in the the rate increases as the number of species present increases on island area, as shown in the red lines, and that the sorry, I I need to clip this part out and start over again explaining biogeography. But this kind of graph always gets me the first time I go through it. The y-axis is rate, either immigration or extinction rate. And it's best to start with talking about the blue lines, the immigration rate. And the idea is that a far island will have a lower rate of immigration rather than a near island, and that there will be a number of species that will be predicted by the island size and the distance to the mainland. Similarly, you can predict the same things with extinction on the other axis, where larger islands will have lower extinction rates than smaller ones. And so where the red and the blue lines cross represent an equilibrium number of species that you expect based on immigration and extinction. This theory, which has been tested a number of different times and sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work so well, was used to create general principles of nature reserves. And they represent some rules that can be classified into 4 general rules. Larger is better, that reserves with less edge are better than those with more edge, that clustered reserves are better than fragmented and isolated reserves, and that habitats corridors are good. Now, in some iterations of this general principles of nature reserves, you see this another rule in there, which is a single large is better than several small reserves. That if you have the same amount of area blocked up into many different small units, that's not as good as a single large reserve. Now, this resulted in the SLOS debate, the single large or several small reserve, and it came down to, of course, details and complexities, and it depends what it is that you're trying to think about or do. That it seems on the surface that a single large reserve may be better than several small reserves for protecting something like say an elephant. However, when people looked at the data and looked at what you were capturing on reserves, in fact, because in 4 small reserves you might likely catch more different area than different habitats than a single large one, you may capture more diversity if you have several small rather than a single large. And in fact, they're better off if they're further spaced apart. So this 4 reserves in the third panel on the bottom that are far apart may be better than that big reserve up over on the left under the better. But be that as it may, that's largely a historical argument now. Dan Simberloff and others were mightily involved in those studies. But this whole idea of fragmentation led to a number of rather large and famous experiments now. This is was originally known as the Minimum Critical Size of Ecosystems Project, and now known as the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments projects. It was begun in 1979 in Manaus, Brazil. The government and the Smithsonian Research Institute and Conservation International all grouped together, along with some private cattle operations that were clearing tropical forest for cattle grazing, and they convinced them to leave fragments of different size and different degrees of isolation in this matrix of area cleared for grazing, and you can see pictures of that on the right. And there was a whole bunch of studies that were then done on these systems to look at what the effects of fragmentation are. And here's a well-cited summary by Bill Lawrence and Tom Lovejoy from the Smithsonian, and Claude Gascon and Richard Beauregard from Conservation International, and a number of other people. And you see, increased wind disturbance in elevated tree mortality. These are some of those things that were from Saunders' paper, the sort of physical effects of fragmentation. Invasion of disturbance-adapted butterfly. It alters species composition of leaf litter ants, so there are these biotic effects. that might follow on from the fragmentation itself or from the increased access because of the surrounding matrix. Down the lower left, you see species area relationships for fragments and controls in the forest, and you see this is just for a small group of birds, but you see that there are rather strong effects of biodiversity by fragmentation, that the fragments, even up to as large as 100 hectares, house considerably fewer species than the mainland or the unfragmented forest. Well, so this experiment has been replicated in a manner of speaking. Nick Haddad at the Savannah River site has put in this kind of fragmentation experiment where, now instead of having clear forest fragments left in amongst pasture, you have forest fragments cleared out of forested habitats, and you have forests that are unconnected patches, the big square. You have these winged patches that represent a larger area like the connected patches up there where you see these two connected patches. So there's there's three different conformations, and again he's looking at movement and the capacity of these different fragments to house biodiversity. So Dubinsky and Holt did a summary of these habitat fragmentation experiments a number of years ago, and I think one of the telling pictures here is that this is ecology, and the idea of doing these experiments, it's difficult. And what do you see in this graph is you see that those sites that are using large fragments, they generally have very, very low replication. It's very difficult to put in a big experiment like this and have a lot of replication. When you do have lots of replication, those points that go up over to the left, you end up with incredibly small plot sizes and looking at species that are then appropriate for those small plot sizes. And so you end up seeing that we have sort of a partial capacity for partial understanding of fragmentation, because we can either do lots of replication on very small species and very small landscapes, or we can do very few or relatively unreplicated experiments for bigger things. But even then, we don't do for these experiments for very big things. And the Haddad and Smithsonian, the Manaus experiments come out as noteworthy because they're really some of the very, very few that are at scale for large organisms. And even there, like Nick Haddad is mostly looking at birds and butterflies, not at mammals. They're too small to be looking at mammals. So there have been a number of reasons to think that there are benefits for connectivity, that you have increased metapopulation persistence, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that you can garner these migration corridors, that because of climate change and other anthropogenic changes, it's good to have connected landscapes, and that people have also borrowed this whole idea for thinking about green belts and how you do urban development. And so I'm going to move on to that bit. This is going to be about 20 slides, and so it's probably going to be, frankly, 2 15-minute lectures, and the next one will probably be longer as well. So I'm going to stop this one now, start posting it up, and start part 2 in just a second.